We're basically an umbrella organisation for the different producer groups in the Barossa region, including a sheep, beef, dairy and 2 ag bureaus. We aim to support, innovate and work with the productivity and sustainability of the grazing systems in our region. We really look at delivering projects that are working with the local producers. We've currently got an MLA producer demonstration site, which is looking at productive pastures for variable climates. We've also got a subsoil monitoring project, which is observing and utilising different information from 3 soil moisture probes located across the region. So those are just 2 of our projects going on at the moment. But if you'd like more information on the Barossa Improved Grazing Group, or BIGG, you can find it on our website. You'll see the link up on the screen. But there's lots of different information there. There's producer case studies on soils or pastures or watercourse rehabilitation. There's also a fair bit of stuff there on fire recovery, particularly relating to native pastures. We've also got current information from our soil moisture monitoring and weather information. If you'd like to receive more information through our monthly newsletter, you can sign up there. And there's also lots of other BIGG related information from all the projects that we've been involved with over the last 5 years that we've been running. Now back to this webinar. It is supported by the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin Natural Resources Management Board through the NRM Levies and funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. It's also supported by our Meat and Livestock Australia producer demonstration site project, which has project partners, our local rural agronomist, Farmer Johns and Coopers of Mount Pleasant. So as you will have seen, the webinar topic is all about preparing perfect pastures. Now producing a perfect pasture is a pretty big ask when there are so many different variables in play, as we all know. But we do aim through this webinar to provide you with tips, tools and some things to think about to help you plan for your 27-2018 pasture program. We have one of the leading South Australian pasture agronomists, Greg Mitchell, to help us through tonight. He's going to be presenting for us. Greg's been involved in subclover improvement and other pasture research in Perza and Sardi for 7 years. But for the last 20 years he's worked privately as a pasture agronomist in the Hills and the Fleurieu region of South Australia, focusing largely on dairy pastures. We've had a good relationship through BIGG with Greg in the past. 4 years ago we all went down, we took a bus from the Barossa down to the Fleurieu and checked out all of the brilliant pastures that are growing down on the Fleurieu. So yeah, really knows his stuff. So just before we get started, I'm going to hand back to Carl and she's going to ask a couple of poll questions so that we can make sure that we make this webinar as relevant to you as possible. Thanks very much, Carlin.
Okay, everybody, thanks, Georgie. We just want to gather some brief contextual information for Greg to frame his presentation. So on your screen, can you please answer the question where you are listening from tonight? In the Barossa, Adelaide Hills, Fleurieu, Mid-North, South-East or other, because we know there may be some of you from interstate. So if everyone just like to click on the screen, please. Okay, that's 86% of you, 89%. All right, let's have a look at the results of that. So there you are, Greg. This is where we're coming through tonight, everybody. 18% from the Barossa and surrounding areas, 45% Adelaide Hills and Fleurieu, and then 28% are actually coming from other areas, Greg. So someone's already typed in the message that they're coming from Manham. Okay, the second poll tonight, I'd just like to ask everybody, I've got to hit the button, launch, here we go. Which best describes your predominant pasture system? Perennial pastures or annual pastures in a cropping rotation? Click away. Okay, I can see most of you have voted. Some of you are typing into me saying that you've ticked both. Right, let's have a look at the results. So there you go, Greg, 68% this evening are perennial pastures and 33% are annual pastures in a cropping rotation. Thanks, everybody. And we're just going to pass over to Greg's screen. So you just pause while we do a little technology transfer. We can see your screen, Greg. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Carlin and Georgie, and g'day to everyone tonight. Preparing for perfect pastures. Well, talking from Mount Compass here tonight, certainly we don't always get things perfect down here on the south coast, as that slide shows. We've still got a bit of fine-tuning to do on occasion, but I think the title of tonight's seminar says so much, the importance of preparation in getting as good a result as possible whenever we're reseeding pastures. My aim tonight, everyone, is to provide some snippets and some tips rather than trying to cover everything in half an hour. I want to spend part of the presentation talking about aspects of establishing exotic perennial grass clover pastures like this Phalaris subclover pasture. But if time permits as well, I'd like to just briefly comment on some of the issues perhaps more specific and different about establishing annual legume type pastures in those mixed farming systems that we flagged a couple of minutes ago. So hopefully with what time we've got, we can cover a fair bit of ground. In talking about establishing perennial grass clover pastures, I thought a useful framework for tonight's presentation was to quickly comment on aspects of the 9 essential steps that the New South Wales Department of Agriculture framed a few years ago. They saw this as a really useful checklist to cover off on the essential issues that they think needs to be addressed when establishing perennial grass legume pastures in medium and high rainfall areas. So we'll quickly just work through these and make a few comments as we go, but in getting a start, I realise we're right on top of autumn sowing time, but the first point that they make is a useful one to reiterate. They suggest assess, select and plan early. I think they're making this point in a wider context so that any intending repasturers out there make sure that all important preparation work is carried out. But just as much as that, think, assess the situation, confirm that the paddock in question actually needs to be resown, and perhaps confirm what other things need to be addressed or what things need to be changed besides the resowing process in order for perhaps the new pasture to succeed. It's really a step back and and have a decent assessment of the whole situation when you're considering investing in new pastures. A couple of case studies that perhaps illustrate the point. This slide is of a degraded pasture heavily infested with that bulbous weed, onion grass or Guildford grass. Now, assessing the pasture and assessing the weeds, think more widely, think how we can't selectively control this weed in the year of reseeding a new pasture. So I'm thinking that this weed needs to be controlled in the preceding year. But as much as that, step back, why is this weed dominating in this paddock? In this instance, we know that onion grass or Guildford grass is strongly associated with infertile soils. Even before we start, the situation is telling me that perhaps we need to address soil fertility as part of renovating this paddock. As much as getting rid of the onion grass and anything else, the situation is telling me that we need to address soil fertility. I have to get that right in order and as part of making a successful renovation in a paddock like this. As opposed to that is another case study, another badly degraded pasture with little perennial grass or clover in it. This situation is quite different though. The same challenge is there, trying to re-establish a new perennial grass clover pasture, but assess, select and plan early. I'm looking at this pasture and yes, it needs repasturing, but what are some of the underlying issues here? the paddock's heavily dominated with weeds that perform in high fertility situations. Very vigorous capeweed, vigorous barley grass. When I assess this situation, indeed it is a utility paddock on a dairy farm, and the underlying problem here is how the paddock is used. The grazing management is never going to let, the existing grazing management is never going to let a perennial grass clover pasture perform to its potential here. And so as much as controlling the weeds, the situation here is telling me up front, maybe I don't need to focus on fertility, but I do need to address grazing management here. Or alternatively, if this paddock has a dedicated role as for utility stocking and utility grazing and feeding out, maybe I'm better off not investing in reseeding here at all, that perhaps I can divert my pasture investment dollars to other paddocks. In all cases, that first point, I think, assess, select and plan early applies, and I'm making that point realising that a lot of farmers will be looking to go reseeding pastures imminently, but even this late, can you please stand back and just consider the situation and what might be the underlying reasons for why a particular paddock is underperforming? The answer to that question might actually, in some situations, lead you to reconsider and perhaps even defer the seeding so that you can fix up any underlying problems. I know we're on top of seeding time now, but the only thing more costly than a compromised pasture reseeding is a failed reseeding. So make sure that you've covered off on the issues that you need to and that there aren't any underlying problems that jeopardise and threaten your new pasture sowings. On this checklist, the second point they make is to focus on ensuring as best possible weed and insect pest control in the spring or the season prior to reseeding. I'm emphasising this point even though we're in autumn. I'm emphasising this point because in my experience in the Hills and Fleurieu district, easily the most common reason for failed pasture sowings is a lack of weed control in the year prior to seeding. When I'm saying that, everyone, I've really got in mind those trashy common annual grass weeds like silvergrass, barley grass, brome grass, which are so prevalent and all too often are probably the key weeds present in a degraded pasture that we're looking to reseed. I think it's optimistic to think that without any prior control, we can rock into autumn, wait for a bit of a germination of what annual grasses are there and rely on a single knockdown spray in autumn to control these sorts of weeds effectively for our new pasture. I think that's optimistic simply because certainly silvergrass and increasingly barley grass, they have staggered weed germinations patterns through autumn and into winter, and almost inevitably a lot of the annual grass weed seeds that are present in paddocks will germinate after the opening rains and after your initial knockdown spray. Far better to ensure these sorts of weeds are controlled effectively in the preceding year. A lot of growers will perhaps rely on hay and silage cuts in the preceding spring. Greg, we cut hay here last year, so we cleaned up the grass weeds. It'll be a clean paddock. But remember, as this slide shows, by silage and hay cutting time in spring, any infested paddocks, the trashy annual grass weeds are well and truly flowering and setting viable seed by silage and hay cutting time. And even though these sorts of infested paddocks might be cut for hay, a lot of the weed seed is already viable. It'll already shatter out onto the ground and be present and infest your new pasture in the following year. So in terms of preparing paddocks for reseeding of these perennial grass clover pastures, I really emphasise, and please check off in your own mind, that yes, annual grass weeds are either not present or yes, they were controlled to a large extent in the preceding spring. Checking soil fertility sounds like a straightforward point, but perhaps a lot of people don't often directly associate soil fertility issues with and as part of a pasture renovation program. I'm not going to spend time here tonight talking about all the relevant soil fertility issues. I simply want to flag that often degraded pastures that need resowing are in that poor condition because of an underlying soil fertility problem. And in that situation, sprays and reseeding in itself doesn't solve a soil fertility problem. So for degraded paddocks that you've earmarked for renovation this year, please check off on the soil fertility issue. We can either read the pre-existing pasture, we can use objective tools like soil testing, but whatever your situation, whenever you're reseeding a new perennial pasture, and remember all of these exotic perennials and pasture legumes that we sow into our pastures, they have a minimum requirement for an adequate level of soil fertility. It's important to make sure that soils are adequately fertile so that we can have the best chances of a successful pasture reseeding. Let's keep working through this New South Wales checklist. They tick off on the issue of grazing in the period leading up to when you resow your pastures, and I think this is an adequate point that I'd like to think we have been addressing. For any pastures that we intend to resow to perennial grass clover pastures this autumn, we've made a point of grazing down any old pasture stubbles, any weed residues. We make a point of grazing out those pastures reasonably well. I suppose the obvious reason for that is to improve the efficacy of our seeding machinery, but there are good agronomic reasons why in the weeks and in the months leading up to an autumn reseeding we ought to have our paddocks grazed down reasonably well. One of those reasons is because by, if you like, cleaning out paddocks reasonably well like this, we actually encourage more of the weed seeds that are still present in these paddocks. We encourage more of those weed seeds to germinate earlier and more densely, and by doing that, that means we're going to get a better subsequent weed kill when we do use our knockdown herbicides ahead of the seeding implement. So for improved weed control and getting the most out of that autumn knockdown spray, we encourage farmers that are reseeding individual paddocks to have those paddocks grazed down reasonably well. The other reason why is because, I suppose, old pasture and old weed residues can harbour some pasture pests and contribute to greater problems in newly sown pastures. I've taken this slide of what was a pretty poorly established direct drilled pasture where there was a lot of old residue hanging around, as you can see. At the end of that pen, they can be difficult to find, but at the end of that pen is a little grey field slug, and there were plenty of them in this pasture, in part because the paddock wasn't prepared properly. There was a lot of residue that was harbouring snails. It made them harder to detect, and it would make any proactive control of slugs and snails harder with more dry residues hanging around. So from my point of view, I really agree with that item 4 on that checklist, that without being stupid about bearing out paddocks unsustainably, attention to grazing down paddocks intended for reseeding. Grazing down in the weeks and the months prior to reseeding, I think, is a really good idea. Georgie, I think everyone hooked up tonight would agree that when we're on the point of actually reseeding our new pastures, absolute attention to full weed control and to controlling insect pests is going to be really important for protecting and getting the best possible pasture strike. I think we'd all agree with that. Again, no time to go through all of the issues. I really wanted to make comment, I suppose, that from my perspective here in the hills, I tend to prefer to direct drill my new sowings of perennial grasses and clovers. I'm not so keen on the strategy of sowing into cultivated seed beds, apart from perhaps the obvious risks or increased risks of erosion and perhaps pugging in the new pasture. I suppose in my experience, as much as creating a level seed bed and getting good new pasture seedling emergence, often I find in the medium and high rainfall areas that extra soil cultivation, particularly on old grazing land, actually stimulates even more broadleaf weed germinations after seeding. In contrast, I think direct drilling normally in grazing lands seems to me to give us the best combination, combination of satisfactory pasture seedling emergence whilst minimising any late germinations of weeds. I normally reserve the strategy of cultivating and preparing a seed bed only if I deliberately need to level a rough paddock, or if I've got a very deliberate need to incorporate lime ahead of a new pasture sowing. But in most situations, I tend to prefer to use agricultural chemicals to direct drill in our new perennial pasture species. In saying that, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily need to have an ongoing reliance on, say, insecticides to keep insect pests at bay indefinitely, but in my mind, I can quite comfortably justify the strategic once-off use of knockdown chemicals and insecticides to give me a good window of weed and insect pest-free conditions to improve pasture strikes. We've got a pretty wide range of agricultural chemicals available to us these days to help us best contend with any autumn weed burdens. In using sprays, probably the only other thing that obviously I need to emphasise is, as always, use any ag chemical as per label instructions, and in relation to using knockdown herbicides prior to a pasture resowing, remember that some chemicals like dicamba, they do incur a short plant back restriction, which we need to observe so that we avoid any chance of any short-term chemical residues damaging our newly emerging pasture seedlings. The New South Wales agronomists, list the point pretty logically. Things aren't going to germinate without adequate soil moisture. But I suppose in relation, in a wider sense, in relation to timing, the timing of our actual autumn resowing operation, I think attention to these preceding issues, Georgie, items 3, 4, the pre-sowing grazing issue, and waiting 3 to 5 weeks after a decent opening rain to get a full autumn weed germination, and ensuring a good chemical knockdown, observing any label plant back restrictions. Attention to all of those issues will basically dictate when I think new autumn sowing should actually be put in the ground. Beyond that point, having said that point, I'd make the comment, I suppose, I have the opinion, but it's not fixed in all situations, but I have the opinion that normally when I'm sowing a new perennial grass legume pasture, I will deliberately wait 10 to 14 days after my knockdown spray before I sow in my new perennial grass clover pasture. Part of the reason why I do that is because I'm waiting to actually see the weeds desiccate and get fixed in my mind that yes, I have got an effective weed kill and that there's no particular need for a second knockdown spray. Remember, this is the last big swing at weeds before the seed goes into the ground, so I'll generally wait 10 to 14 days if I can between the first knockdown spray and when I actually drill my pasture seed into the ground. The other reason why I do that is, I suppose, in some instances, pasture sowings do suffer from soil-borne root diseases in the soil. I think anybody subscribing tonight from the mid-north area would be more aware than me about the incidence of soil-borne diseases and their effect on broadacre crops, on cereal crops. Well, soil-borne diseases and a different suite of pathogens can similarly attack newly sown perennial grass seedlings. And I know that the BIGG group itself has been focused in recent years on the impact of certain root rot diseases on annual clovers and annual legumes in our pastures. In the same way, these sorts of pathogens can certainly damage any newly sown legume component in our pasture mixtures. it's not an absolute way to control soil-borne diseases by any stretch. But in my experience, I seem to have the worst problems with damping off and other soil-borne diseases that attack young pasture seedlings. I have the worst results when I send the seeder in, you know, soon after the first knockdown spray, when my weeds haven't even desiccated yet. I think that short-term fallow helps somewhat in perhaps reducing or interrupting soil-borne pathogens in the soil and improving pasture strokes. So I hope that's a tip that some people might relate to and might consider. Accurate seed placement. I think everybody subscribing tonight is wired into the fact that that when sowing any of our small seeded pasture species, the normal aim is to drill our pasture seed with about 12 millimetres of soil cover over the seed. The old sowing our new pasture seed 1/2 inch deep. I think that guideline is as relevant now as it ever was, and the choice on which seeding machines we might care to invest in or use, more than anything else, I don't really care about tines versus discs, colours of machines. More than anything else, I'm interested in a machine and a seeding operation that can simply give me accurate seeding depth for our small seeded pasture species. For sure, a lot of contractors and a lot of farmers in the hills and fluoro districts have invested in some of the latest seeding machinery with you know, more flexible configurations and seeding depth control. This is a triple disc seeder, but there are a whole range of configurations out there. These machines perhaps offer more flexibility in situations with either rougher ground, more or less trash left in paddocks, and importantly, probably their best feature for mine is accommodating all of those variations. A lot of machines seem to be able to offer us better seeding depth control at greater ground speeds. But having said that, I'm aware of a lot of pastoralists in the hills and fluoro districts that in a lot of situations on any of our, you know, typical duplex soils, we can get away with, you know, some pretty rudimentary drill equipment. Sometimes we need to drill slower than we'd otherwise like. Sometimes we have to pay more attention to removing trash, but overwhelmingly I'm not so fussy about which machine we're using. I'm real fussy about looking behind the seeder and ensuring that our seed is placed with 1/2 inch of soil cover over the seed. The little experimental seeder that we actually use with our trial and demonstration work has a very simple tine configuration, as you can see in this slide, just loosen points configured on some coil tines. We've got this configured, and I'll be honest, everyone, I do have a bit of a preference for tined seeding equipment because I think in general, properly configured, I think tined machinery just gives us a bit of an opportunity to configure the undercarriage so that we're tilling, so that we're able to till the soil a bit deeper in the sowing row than where we place the seed. Just as for broadacre cropping equipment, I think small pasture seeds will germinate a bit better and be a bit more resilient against pathogens and have stronger initial root growth if we can actually sow seed with tilth, a bit of tilth below the seed as well as around the seed. But overwhelmingly, more than anything else, all I'm interested in, as always, is just getting that accurate seed depth placement, 1/2 inch of soil cover over our small pasture seeds. I think everybody again would agree too that having made all this investment, items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on, having put the seed in the ground, it would be crazy not to keep an eye on our new pastures, and indeed my strong suggestion is to check pastures weekly from seeding. If we've followed all of those pre-seeding steps properly when setting our paddock up for new perennial grass clover sowings, I'd like to think that we shouldn't have too many weed problems in a newly germinated establishing pasture. I'm really keen to minimise the use of selective herbicides or the reliance on selective herbicides in newly emerged pastures, apart from the cost. Although I think we all know that we have a range of herbicides available for selective weed control in young pastures, I think we're kidding ourselves to think that those herbicides don't have some effect on the young seedlings. And I think far better to focus on all the strategies to minimise the incidence of weeds, focus on all the issues leading up to seeding rather than putting a lot of weight on the use of post-emergent herbicides. Sometimes we can clean up weeds in a young pasture. Sometimes those weeds can't be controlled depending on your choice of pasture species, and sometimes we incur extra damage on your young pasture along the way. So please, that's why I'm emphasising all of the earlier points that I am about preparation. Having said that, I think we'd all agree that we should all be out there having made these big investments and having committed paddocks to reseeded perennial grass legume pastures. We should be out there checking these pastures at least weekly, checking on emergence, certainly checking for the incidence of any weeds in the new pasture, but perhaps critically checking for damage from any insect pests and other pests that might be present from seeding. I think everyone subscribed tonight would be aware of the range of common insect pests that can damage our newly establishing pastures, the complex of earth mites, lucerne flea, underground pests like cockchafers. But I think what we also need to be aware of is the fact that these guys might not only just damage newly emerged pastures, several of these insects can and do damage and destroy new pastures as they emerge and even before they emerge. That attention to getting effective weed control from effective insect pest control from day one, I think is important. In terms of snippets of information, increasingly the clients that I deal with here on the hills and fluoro, we're out there checking our new sowings weekly, but increasingly when we sow perennial grass clover pastures, what will be long-term pastures, my clients and I, we're actually deliberately applying bare earth insecticide treatments within 2 or 3 days of sowing. That simply, we'd rather not take the chance of any early insect pest damage, and I think we've got, as I say, the insecticide products available to us that can assist us to get good short-term residual control from sowing day. I'm aware that for several years, broadacre croppers in the mid-north, for their susceptible pulse and canola crops, they've been using bare earth insecticides from seeding. I gather a very commonly used mix in broadacre cropping areas is a mixture of bifenthrin and chlorpyrifos insecticides. And in the last couple of years, Georgie, increasingly graziers in the hills and fluoro are applying that sort of bare earth insecticide as a strategic once-off bare earth treatment to ensure good short-term residual control and protection from insect pests. Correct grazing for a new pasture. Well, that's a motherhood statement if I've ever read one. Exactly. What does that mean? For mine, I suppose I just want to make a couple of points about grazing of the new pasture. I think most people subscribe tonight would agree that, yeah, we shouldn't be too aggressive, we shouldn't be too greedy when grazing or utilising a new perennial pasture in the first year. I suppose a couple of guidelines that might be helpful in the discussion. Certainly only, in my mind, don't even consider grazing until you are sure that all of your new pasture seedlings are firmly anchored into the ground. That applies for any new pasture sowing, and for obvious reasons. We don't want uprooting, we don't want serious trampling damage on caused by overly zealous early grazings. That point in mind, though, I think that, you know, with judiciously a bit of intermittent grazing in the first year will normally not damage a new pasture. How much grazing in the first year, I think, really depends on which pasture species you have sown. If your pasture mix includes aerial seeding legumes like annual medics, Barossa clover, we want to maximise their seed set in the first year. So for aerial seeding species, we definitely advocate that paddocks should be destocked in the first spring. Similarly, the perennial grass phalaris gets a lot stronger and a lot more resilient if it's allowed to run up to head in the first spring. So I recommend to my clients not to graze new phalaris pastures in the first spring. As opposed to that, I think the more prostrate growing subterranean clover, I think subclover pastures can be judiciously grazed through the first year. In my experience, perennial ryegrass pastures similarly can be lightly grazed through the first spring and without damaging the pasture at all. So rather than ramble on, I think correct grazing for new pasture, bear in mind those guidelines and think about the requirements for the particular species that you've sown when perhaps fine-tuning any grazing management in the first year and particularly the first spring. Now, with what time we've got left, maybe 5 minutes if that's okay, Georgie, I just wanted us for a couple of minutes to just consider, with that story in mind, what changes if instead of sowing perennial pastures in long-term pastoral land, what about if we're sowing just annual-based pastures? What if we're sowing just annual medic or just subclover type pastures alone? I'm aware that annual pastures are very commonly sown in mixed pasture systems following a cereal cropping phase. What changes in those situations? Sowing just annual legumes, normally annual legume seedlings are more vigorous and establish more quickly than perennial grass seedlings. And coming out of a cropping phase, I'd like to think that in the majority of situations, cropping farmers would have paid attention and would be growing relatively weed-free crops in that preceding year leading up to reseeding. So in both senses, that's a slightly different scenario. How does that influence which seeding method we can use? Well, that was the question very quickly that was addressed by Department of Ag researchers back in the 1980s. I apologise for a few numbers in this table, but this table summarises the results across a series of 9 trials that were conducted over 3 years back in the 1980s. 9 trial sites spreading from Turretfield in the south up to Jamestown in the north, where the researchers compared 6 different methods for resowing, in this case annual subclover pastures, following a cropping phase. After that cropping phase, and after managing through slashing and grazing, managing crop stubbles down to manageable levels to allow seeding, they trialled 6 methods to re-establish subclovers in each of these 9 trials. They either went out ahead of the main opening rains and simply direct sowed the subclover seeds into the ground with 1/2 inch soil cover, or prior to seeding they dropped the seed on the surface. As opposed to that, another series of treatments involved waiting until after the opening rains and then sowing their subclover seed mixtures using one of 4 methods. This table presents average results over all of those 9 trials. You can see in the second column the average sowing date for each of these treatments, so that on average they were dry sowing their treatments on average across those 9 trials on the 19th of April, and you can see the respective sowing dates for all of the 4 later sowing treatments post-break. I'll leave that slide up for a second, but I suppose overwhelmingly the results that came out of this series of trials showed that they could get good, and indeed they got the best strikes and establishments of their sown subclovers simply by going out prior to the opening rains with managed stubbles and dry sowing, dry drilling their subclover seed into the ground. That compared to the other treatments, that gave them probably the best, well, did give them the best strikes overall of sown subclover, and it certainly gave them very satisfactory, if not the best overall balance of total legume in these lay pastures, and the best balance of more legume, less weeds, and certainly minimising bare ground. It was an interesting set of results, and the researchers certainly emphasised these results and the fact that perhaps we could take advantage of the logistical advantages of dry sowing pastures if we are trying to establish annual clovers after a cereal cropping phase. Dry sowing compared to these other methods is going to be cheaper. It allows us to perhaps get our pasture sowing work out of the way before more of the main crop seeding workload is upon us. Clearly, with earlier seeding, less resulting bare ground, less erosion risks, and because we're sowing earlier and perhaps retaining more background clover and admittedly in a balance, more of any background species, they were definitely getting more winter feed by dry sowing. And I suppose having said all of that, although no post-emergent herbicides were used in these trials, we still have the option in this day and age to make use of selective herbicides to at least manage, if we see the need to, weed content in any of our newly established pastures. It was an interesting set of results. I wouldn't think that universally we should always dry sow, but these results have given a lot of people a lot of confidence that we can logistically and reliably sow annual legume pastures after a cereal cropping phase, provided those cereal crops were relatively weed-free, provided, and always bear in mind when you're returning paddocks to pastures after a cropping phase, be aware of any chemical residue carryover issues from herbicides used in the cropping phase. And certainly these trial results still relied on the fact that, as required, red-legged earth mite and any other insect pests were controlled soon after seeding. So perhaps with what time a few minutes we had, I hope that perhaps for annual pasture producers, that set of results perhaps is an interesting little insight. Now I think I'll wrap up the formal presentation there, Georgie. I wanted to finish by simply making note that here in the high rainfall areas, we, as much as anywhere else, have to meet the challenge of effective weed control when we're sowing new perennial pastures. We want to try and minimise the loss of any winter feed when we're sowing pastures. To that end, when the big group came down a few years ago down to the south coast, we mentioned how local research and local producers were trialling spring sowing practices, and over the last 5 years, with a run of good and certainly bad springs, spring sowing properly executed has proven to be a pretty reliable way for us to establish new pastures, to better control our winter weeds, and because we're sowing pastures at the end of winter and not at the start of winter, we're avoiding the loss of winter feed. We don't have time to run more into that. Perhaps that's an issue for another webinar, but in terms of contending with some of the issues that we've talked about tonight, the implication of some of the things we've talked about might have individual growers with individual paddocks perhaps considering and maybe thinking about deferring their pasture sowings if they haven't adequately ticked off on and addressed all of the issues that we've talked about on that checklist tonight. But I hope that presentation has been of some use, and I'll hand back to you, Georgie.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Greg. That's really given us a lot to think about and work towards perennial pasture establishment for either this year or next year, as the case may be. So now we're going to open up to questions. I'll just pass over to Carlin so that she can explain how to do the questions here.
Okay, I can see that some of you have already typed some questions in here for Greg to answer, so I'll read out those questions. Or what you can do is raise your hand and I'll then be able to unmute you and you can ask your question to Greg yourself. But the first question here, Greg, refers to that table that you just had up. And the question is, how long after sowing were these figures taken on that trial?
So I think we're talking in relation to the trial looking at strategies to establish annual subclover pastures. Those composition results were taken in early spring, so you can see on average the sowing times for each of those treatments. Certainly those composition results for each of the 9 trials were taken in early spring. My understanding is early mid-September those results were collected.
Second question, Greg, is perennial pasture weed control. Opinion on use of double knockdowns, please.
Potentially very useful for two reasons. Sometimes when we are reseeding perennial pastures, they're certainly in the hills and fluoro districts, there is sometimes perhaps an excessive delay between knockdown spray and seeding. And again, as always, Carlin, simply because this is the last opportunity to particularly control grass weeds prior to getting our new perennial grass seedlings out of the ground, I want to ensure complete control. On that basis, I definitely reserve the option of double knock prior to sowing a new perennial pasture. The other reason why I do, particularly in rundown old pasture situations, we don't always remove the trash. We might have this staggered germination problem, but more particularly, some of the trashy weeds that we'll sometimes contend with, annual fog, old ryegrass varieties, they actually take a bit of killing, and as I emphasised in my presentation, I'll normally wait and convince myself that I'm getting a good desiccation on my weeds before I sow. Some of the annual weeds, similarly, I think, particularly some of the geranium species, sometimes don't get fully controlled even with our most sophisticated single application knockdown mixes, and a double knock where we're combining chemical groups as well as knocking on 2 dates, I think adds to even control of some common weeds like geranium. So I definitely think double knock sprays ahead of pasture resowing has a role.
Okay, they're rolling in now. Next one is, what perennials would you recommend for a low rainfall 350mm area such as the Murraylands?
Perennials for such a dry environment, I suppose up front of the conventional pasture species, perennial pasture species that we grow, easily the one with the most drought tolerance would be lucerne, and I'd suggest in many respects suited to a low rainfall mallee type environment, relatively alkaline soil profiles, lighter soil textures. To the extent that those pastures might be managed under more extensive grazing management, maybe in a situation where they might be getting sown in a mixed farming situation, I think we've got a reasonable diversity of lucernes available to us to allow it to be used productively in a range of situations, even in lower rainfall environments. Lucerne would be my first comment there. As far as perennial pasture grasses go, I think there's been some attention on improved earlier maturing and more summer dormant cultivars of cocksfoot and phalaris and other perennial grasses. Although I don't have a lot of experience, from my perspective, I wouldn't have a lot of faith in investing heavily in cocksfoot, phalaris varieties, even more novel type cultivars in such a low rainfall environment. I wonder whether perhaps our most robust perennial pasture grass that we see in medium and low rainfall environments, perennial veld grass, I think that would be a challenging enough environment for perennial veld grass, let alone trying to focus on more improved but perhaps less proven perennial grasses for such a challenging environment.
Okay, next question. Do you have a favourite pasture species guide for soil type, rainfall, etc.? Is there a guide? They're looking for a guide. Is there a favourite guide that people can look up?
Oh, a guide, a reference.
Yeah, do you have a favourite pasture species guide is the question.
The guide that comes to mind, and the guide that comes to mind, a book published by the Victorian Department of Agriculture a few years ago, Pastures for Southwestern Victoria, although it's a different environment, was a very comprehensive manual of pasture species, high and low rainfall pasture species, and in particular their adaptation and their grazing requirements. So that's probably my favourite. Having said that, I need to be, I want to be very open here, Carlin and Georgie. I give credit to you know, the main principal seed companies that are operating in South Australia. They've all done a very good job in recent years of producing really good reference material on the species that they market as much as their individual varieties. So there is a lot of good information out there, including from some of the major seed companies. But Greg's all-time favourite on top of the shelf is Pastures for Southwestern Victoria.
Okay, hopefully I've interpreted that question right. I'm sure they'll message back if I have interpreted that incorrectly.
No worries.
The next question is expecting snails and slugs to be bad this year? Question mark, question mark.
I'm expecting slugs and snails to be worse than they have been in previous years. For us in the hills environment, the wet conditions and importantly the mild summer conditions, from my perspective it's been a mild summer, both those things are, you know, would have favoured the build-up and the survival of slugs in our environment. The fact that for so many paddocks we've carried over a lot more feed and trash on our paddocks into summer because of the solid spring rains. That's harbouring more snail and slug pests, and it's also been further insulating the ground, keeping the topsoil cooler through summer, remembering that slugs harbour underground. Short answer to that question is yes.
Okay, 2 to go on my list. What is a good overseed pasture to help coverage in a pasture of veld grass in a non-wetting sand?
I'm interpreting that as what would be a good oversowing option of a short or a long-term feed, just simply to add some bulk to a pre-existing veld grass pasture. I'm thinking probably just a forage cereal of some description where we can perhaps access cheap seed. We're probably going to be we're going to be sowing a forage that's going to have more vigorous seedling growth and get out of the ground as soon as possible when soil moisture is adequate. Remembering if this is a non-wetting soil situation, that might be early. It might actually be, you know, a month or two from now before we get a full germination. I think if we were just simply aiming to bulk up an existing veld grass pasture for this season only, without any other particular attention, I'd probably just be using a cheap forage cereal seed.
Okay, and we've got the final question before we wrap up this evening. What influences summer dormancy for grasses such as wallaby grass and Casbah cocksfoot, if I said it correctly? For example, in a vineyard cover crop does slashing during seed set prolong summer activity?
I think it would have the potential to. It certainly does. Slashing and preventing seed head development does defer or does suppress summer dormancy in some of our other common pasture species. I don't particularly know for wallaby grass nor for Casbah cocksfoot, but I would suspect to some extent it would suppress summer dormancy.
Okay, there's Georgie. Do we have time for one last question? Just a quick one, Greg. When would you add a spike to Glyphosate light hammer and what weed spectrum?
I would add a spike to glyphosate in autumn 1 if I was particularly focused on getting as quick a brown out desiccation as possible. Some of the spikes will speed up the desiccation. I will certainly add a spike to glyphosate if I need to effectively control background legumes. If I need to control geranium, I find that glyphosate by itself is not very good at all on geranium. If you are trying to, as best you can, control perennial weeds like dock and sorrel, I would definitely be spiking glyphosate with dicamba herbicide. So problem weeds like geranium, like dock, like sorrel would be them, and indeed background legumes, clovers or medics, if they needed to be controlled. In all of those situations, I would be looking to add spike herbicides to my glyphosate. Fortunately, the glyphosate labels that are on the drum tend to give the grower a pretty good direction about necessary spikes for different weed spectrums.
Okay, great job, Greg. Georgie, I'll just pass over to you for wrapping up comments.
Yep, thanks very much, Carlin, and thank you, Greg, and thank you to everybody who registered and signed in tonight. Hopefully you've gotten a little bit of information or some tips or some interesting facts that you can take home and take back onto your own properties. As I said before, the big group's all about practical pasture information, grazing management, soil testing, all of that sort of thing. So if you do need any more information, please head over to our website. I would like to thank you very much, Greg, for the presentation you delivered tonight. As always, very practical, brilliant take-home messages, and lots of good case studies as well, which is, I think, how farmers really learn particularly well. So thank you very much for that, Greg. Any final comments from you, Greg?
No, just thank you very much for having me, and congratulations to BIGG and to Carlin for making this happen, but congratulations to BIGG for initiating the series of webinars. Well done.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Greg. I would also like to thank Carlin very much. This was the first webinar that BIGG have ever put on, and the behind-the-scenes stuff that Carlin has done has been brilliant, and we definitely couldn't have done it without you. So thank you very much, Carlin.
No worries, thanks Georgie. We'll organise that this webinar has been recorded, and I'll forward that link to Georgie tomorrow, and she'll distribute some follow-up emails to all the participants, and also there'll be a evaluation survey as you leave tonight's webinar. So I'm just going to end it, just click close for everybody. So have a good night, and you'll hear from Georgie later on in the week. Thanks everybody.